So far, let's play a game. So far, which ones of these sanctions should be removed to help the Venezuelan people not live in misery? Which ones? Can we maybe just consider that the government that has been there for 25 years has a little bit to blame? Just a little bit, a smidge. No? Hi guys, welcome back. Excited to be here again. If you have been with me for a while on my channel, you might have noticed that I'm shifting gears a little bit now because I consider the Venezuelan issue, an issue that affects the entire continent, somewhat a little bit more important than the topic of the manosphere. So in my last video, I said that I was born and raised in Caracas, the capital of Venezuela, once the wealthiest country in Latin America, the jewel of South America, and in the list of top 20 countries when it came to economic freedom. And now, a story of tragedy, a cautionary tale, a story of what could have been but wasn't. Now, Venezuela exports crime and people in the entire continent of America, both south and north. Now the exporter of Castrochavismo, which is essentially destroying democracies all over the continent. If you are from the USA or Canada, you're not spared. The instability of the region concerns the northern countries as well, believe it or not, and also Europe, because these people are getting into Spain. Rumors say, and even some quality sources, that these people have financed political campaigns in Spain. But that's a story for another day. Today, I want to address a specific topic which comes up over and over again in common sections of the English-speaking world when it comes to Venezuela. Sanctions and their contribution to the Venezuelan economic collapse. Now, to me, the idea that sanctions are the ones that created the problem is absolutely ridiculous, to the point that I have not bothered to look too much into it because, clarification, I had not looked into it, but now I have. This is what this video is about. I remember that in 2002, there were massive protests against Chavez. I remember how the people that were against the protest shot at protesters from a bridge. I remember when there started to be rationing of water and electricity when I was pretty young. I remember when my friends started leaving, and all this happened before the sanctions, way before the sanctions. So whenever I read someone saying that the issue is the sanctions, what I hear them saying is, I actually don't know anything about Venezuela, but I want to blame the United States. So regardless of my ignorance on the matter, I will still voice a very strong opinion. Doesn't matter if it goes against what millions of Venezuelans are saying. I'm probably smarter than all of them and more informed, despite my lack of knowledge of the region. That's the vibe. That's the vibe I'm getting. Okay? It's giving I'm smarter than everyone else vibes. It's giving people in Latin America are dumb. Also, it does seem to me that these people have either very short memories or they never knew that Venezuela has been facing an economic crisis and widespread protests long before the sanctions that affected the economy were imposed. So let's talk about this. Let's talk about how Chavismo, a political system, an ideology, a narco regime, whatever you want to call it, Chavismo that has been ruling the country for 25 years, managed to turn a somewhat stable democracy and a wealthy country into the economic disaster it is today. So, Chavez gets elected in 1988, running on anti-corruption, anti-poverty, freedom, whatever you want to call it, that platform. He wants to revitalize democracy in the country. Seems so ironic now, 25 years later. And I'm going to leave aside all the other aspects that destroyed the country, like the political and the social, and focus on the economic side, because these are directly related to the sanctions, right? So first, Chavez nationalized key industries. That includes oil, telecommunications, and electricity. The oil industry became the primary source of government revenue. This allowed Chavez to finance a lot of social projects that ultimately kept the poor happy. And that was his base, his voting base. And he was lucky because in the early 2000s, prices were very, very high. When he entered office, the price of an oil barrel was about $8, and it skyrocketed to about $104, if I'm not mistaken, a little bit over $100 shortly thereafter. And due to a lot of his policies, which I will get into, the Venezuelan economy became super reliant on oil exports. And what happens when oil prices drop? Well, we have the results, right? Hard lesson for anyone. If your one source of income suddenly vanishes or diminishes, you're in trouble, right? I mean, anyone can see that coming. Not even to mention the way he destroyed the capacity of the Venezuelan oil industry due to mismanagement. Venezuela is producing around 700,000 oil barrels. We could be producing millions, okay? PDVSA, the Venezuelan petroleum industry, became highly inefficient because it became very politicized. Many of the experienced managers and other engineers working there were replaced by government loyalists. Was that also the US's fault? The CIA? The sanctions? No. I mentioned some of my friends left in the early 2000s. Well, some of their parents worked at PDVSA, but that's another topic. The way that the country became so over-reliant on oil and an already diminished industry was in part a result of expropriation of private businesses, including farms and factories, and some international businesses operating in Venezuela. And I will give some examples in a little bit. He also implemented price controls on basic goods. Guess what? A lot of businesses started shutting down, and business owners started leaving the country because they could just not maintain their production. They could not keep their business afloat. Do you think capital flight is good for the economy of a nation? Not really, right? And then fast forward, Chavez dies. A lot of people thought this was the end of Chavismo, but no, clearly not. A Cuban puppet was about to be installed, Maduro. Now, Maduro is a continuation of Chavez, okay? He's not a separate entity. He is a continuation of what Chavez started. He has the same people surrounding him. But Cuba is more in control of him than the other way around, which was not the case with Chavez. Chavez was more of a leader who was using Castro as sort of a wise old man and keeping the Cuban dictatorship alive. You know, in the late 90s, a lot of Latin American countries got together and they realized, or they came to the conclusion that the Cuban dictatorship was just going to go away on its own, because since the Soviet Union had fallen apart, they had no one to cling on to. The Cuban dictatorship could not sustain itself by itself, on its own. So they had all come together to figure out a way to get rid of this plague in the continent, this dictatorship, and they come to the conclusion, we don't need to do anything. They're going to go away on its own. But then what happens? Chavez comes in the late 90s, and immediately he starts giving oxygen to the Cuban dictatorship. He saves it, essentially. Now, the Castrochavismo thing, that entails a topic in and of itself. So maybe for another time. Anyway, oil prices drop dramatically when he first comes into office. Completely the opposite of Chavez. So that over-reliance on oil that Chavez has begun gave way to an economic crisis of epic proportions. Now, at this time, the sanctions that are in place are for specific Venezuelan individuals that have been found to have links to drug trafficking, terrorism, and human rights crimes. So these are not affecting the economy. The plunge in oil prices crippled the government's ability to continue their social programs and maintain basic services like running water and electricity. Remember that they nationalized the electric sector? Okay. I remember, as I said in the beginning, in my childhood, the rationing of water and electricity. And so there is a continuation of mismanagement of the economy, and it's only getting worse. There's continued expropriation of private businesses and hyperinflation again before the sanctions. Millions of Venezuelans have left at this point, including a lot of my family, a lot of my friends, a lot of my family friends. I could go on and on. The humanitarian crises and the exodus had already begun. The first people that started leaving were the people that were were the business people, the people that could afford it, right? The people that have left in the last few years have been leaving through more irregular channels. And that's what you're mostly hearing about on the news. You're not hearing about people like boarding on a plane, getting their visa, and getting out of the country with a second nationality, right? The humanitarian crisis, the exodus, began before the sanctions. Again, Venezuela has the biggest oil reserves in the continent. I meant to say here the biggest oil reserves in the world, the biggest gold reserves in the continent. And Venezuela also has significant natural gas reserves, which account for 73% of total natural gas reserves in South America. It could have a very powerful hydroelectric sector. The same government for 25 years, and the country has spiraled into misery. Is it really the fault of the US? Or can we maybe just consider that the government that has been there for 25 years has a little bit to blame? Just a little bit, a smidge. No? The government neglected sectors like agriculture and manufacturing to focus mostly on oil, which might have worked at a time to keep the facade that things were going well when oil prices were really high, but not anymore. Did the US also make them neglect other sectors? Did the CIA do that? Did the sanctions have them make these moronic decisions? Explain to me how they did this. And I don't think so. Are these moronic decisions, or are they on purpose to keep the population poor and weak? Something to consider, given that one government functionary said once that on television that he didn't want more people going out to the middle class and then becoming part of the bourgeoisie. But maybe he said that with the best intentions possible. Maybe, or was that CIA too, or maybe sanctions, I don't know. The price controls I mentioned earlier often resulted in many producers not being able to cover the costs of basic goods. So the shortages began. Severe shortages. Again, all of these before the sanctions on industry even happened. So this led to the proliferation of black markets, very thriving black markets, where people who had money started buying basic goods. And so this increased inequality even further. There's so many things happening that are destroying the country, okay? So many things. Currency exchange controls, printing money and hyperinflation, the devaluation of the Bolivar, and the creation of a new currency. In 2021, the Maduro government literally removed zeros from the currency, and this was not the first time that happened. Chavez did the same thing. But that didn't do anything to the underlying issues. Venezuela was once a major food producer in Latin America, and now it's importing 70% of its food. So, let me give you a quick rundown of some of the companies which were expropriated by Chávez and Maduro. Some of them. And then they were then given over to inefficient managers. In the oil sector, we have Helmerich and Payne, Schlumberger, sorry if I'm not pronouncing this correctly, Weatherford and Halliburton, among others. In the agricultural sector, we have Agroisleña, a Venezuelan agricultural supply company, which was a private agricultural company founded in 1958 in Venezuela by Spanish immigrants and then expropriated in 2010 by the Venezuelan government and subsequently destroyed. Then we have the privately owned cattle ranches Hato El Frío and Hato La Vergareña, expropriated in 2008. Became a lot less productive and useful and less profitable after the expropriation. Do you see a pattern here? Then in the steel and construction sector, we have Sidor, which was nationalized in 2008 so that the government could gain control over that industry. And unfortunately, efficiency in production declined after the expropriation. Shocker. Chavez also expropriated major cement companies like Cemex, a Mexican company, Swiss company Holcim, and Francis Lafarge. Again, surprise, surprise, declined in production as well. I could keep going. I could. They targeted all essential industries and more. So the impact of expropriations, as you could tell, decline in production, loss of foreign investment, and supply chain disruptions. Let's quickly go through the specific sanctions. Since 2018, there have been visa restrictions for certain individuals that the US government has linked to corruption and or human rights abuses. There have been terrorism-related sanctions in which there have been prohibition on US commercial arms sales and retransfers to Venezuela, as well as specifically identifying two Venezuelan individuals linked to Hezbollah. Then there are drug trafficking related sanctions in which the US Treasury has imposed sanctions on 11 individuals and 25 companies with connections to Venezuela by designating them as specialty designated narcotics traffickers pursuant to the Foreign Narcotics Kingpin Destination Act. So far, let's play a game. So far, which ones of these sanctions should be removed to help the Venezuelan people not live in misery? Which ones? Okay, we continue. The Obama imposed targeted sanctions related to anti-democratic actions, human rights violations, and corruption. This was in response to increasing repression in Venezuela, and so certain individuals were identified as responsible for significant acts of violence, serious human rights abuses, or anti-democratic actions. These included visa restrictions and asset blocking. Again, which of these sanctions do you dictator defendants think should be removed? So then comes President Trump. He started issuing broader sectoral sanctions and financial sanctions, which limited the Venezuelan government access to U.S. financial markets. Not entirely, just some limitations on it, and I could go deeper into it, but Trump's sanctions on Maduro and his government were the harshest so far. Did some of those sanctions have a negative impact on the Venezuelan economy? Sanctions introduced in 2017, 2018. I'm not going to pretend otherwise because yes, these sanctions did have an impact on an already crippled economy, on an economy heavily relying on the government, but also it had an impact on Maduro's regime. I venture to guess that if these sanctions had not been relieved by the Biden administration, the Maduro regime would not have been able to hold on. According to some Venezuelan independent journalists like Castrochavismo, during the time that Trump was in office, due to the pressure on the system, there were 2 failed military uprisings. Yes, they failed, but they happened. And that's a sign that things were not going well. Now, when Biden came to office, they gave a little bit of oxygen to the Venezuelan government, to the Venezuelan narco regime. The Venezuelan government was begging for the sanctions to be removed. The conditions given by the Biden administration for them to be removed is that Maduro was to hold free and fair elections in 2024. Great. Well, now we're here. Now we're in 2024. The Maduro government blocked the main opposition contender, Maria Corina Machado. They didn't allow her to fly around the country. They blocked her candidacy. And anyone that helped her in any way, a lot of the times were arrested. Like if she stopped at a restaurant to eat, that restaurant might have been shut down. Or someone drove her across state lines, that person would have been arrested. Despite all of that, she still managed to build a strong opposition movement and a strong civic movement and won the elections with a candidate that she proposed. Now, and I know a lot of people think that it's kind of strange that a dictatorship would have elections, but the thing is, guys, like, they're a dictatorship that is pretending to be democracy for the rest of the world. The elections haven't been fair in Venezuela for a long, long time. But the movement that Maria Corina was betting on was a movement that wanted to bet on the legitimacy of what they wanted to propose. So that's why we are here today. Again, how she did it and how she proved that they won, another topic. Okay? So the question is, are the sanctions really to blame for the economic situation? I would say clearly not. But let's elaborate more on that. If the Venezuelan government had not previously destroyed the economy, the international sanctions would not have had much of an impact. There was already, a pre-existing economic fragility that entailed economic mismanagement. The Venezuelan economy was already in freefall due to a combination of over-reliance in oil, nationalization of key industries, as I mentioned, price and currency controls, and the dismantling of private sector capacity. By the time the international sanctions were imposed, hyperinflation, food and medicine shortages, and a lack of basic services were already widespread. And the economic fragility also entailed a loss of production capacity, expropriation of companies, and the lack of investment led to a collapse in oil production, the country's primary source of revenue, and in other sectors. If Venezuela's government had maintained a stable, diversified economy, it would have had a stronger base to withstand external shocks, including sanctions. Then second, limited capacity to respond to sanctions. So this manifests in two ways: financial and economic mismanagement and an inability to access credit. So the first, economic and financial mismanagement. The government's decision to impose strict currency controls and print money to cover deficits resulted in hyperinflation. These policies significantly weakened Venezuela's financial position, leaving it with limited foreign reserves to buffer against impacts of sanctions. So the second, the inability to access credit. Even before the more severe sanctions, Venezuela's access to international credit markets was very limited due to their own default on foreign debt. Had the economy been better managed, the country might have had alternative financial avenues to mitigate the impact of sanctions. What the sanctions did was magnify existing issues, like the over-reliance on oil, the already inefficient oil industry, which a more robust industry might have been able to withstand. Even before the sanctions, a vast amount of state resources were misallocated, lost in the ether. Tell me how Chávez's daughter is a millionaire today without having worked a day in her life, with money both in US banks and in Andorra. Currently, Maduro's official monthly salary is about $4,000 a month. Do we believe that that's all they're taking in to make Similar to Chavez to make his daughter a millionaire? No. To put it simply, Venezuela is being ruled by a drug cartel, the Cartel de los Soles. They're first drug trafficking kingpins. They're first a drug cartel, and then they're governing officials. They use the whole government thing as a way to have protection. They have kidnapped a whole nation to do their dirty work. So, sanctions are really, really not the biggest issue Venezuela has. So, to conclude, guys, the international sanctions did exacerbate the Venezuelan crisis by cutting off crucial revenue streams and access to international financial systems. It would be dishonest of me to say that they didn't have an impact. However, the Venezuelan government's economic policies, such as nationalizations, expropriations, over-reliance on oil, corruption, and an inefficient management, had already set the stage for collapse. In fact, the economy had already collapsed. Without these pre-existing conditions, Venezuela would have been likely in a much stronger position to weather sanctions. Or, if these people hadn't been there in the first place, the sanctions would not have happened, maybe. The economic collapse was primarily self-inflicted, and sanctions served to intensify an already dire situation. So let me tell you a secret. Most Venezuelans don't mind the sanctions. What most Venezuelans want right now is for this government to fall, to leave. If the sanctions are what leads to that, well, and so be it. So that's it for today, guys. I hope you enjoyed this one, and see you next time.